Hello, and thank you for joining me here today. If you don't know me already, my name is Zach Keith. I'm the owner of Fitness Simplified. In this video, we're going to talk about VO2max, what it is, why you should care about it, how to measure it, and how to improve it. Now, there's a lot of fancy terms that tend to get thrown around a lot in the fitness world. VO2max tends to be one of those terms, and it's not necessarily the easiest to define at a first glance. However, whether you are an athlete or someone who just wants to improve their quality of life, it is worth having a basic understanding of what your VO2 max is and how you can take better control of it. So, starting off, let's talk about what your VO2 max actually is. Put simply, your VO2 max is the maximal volume of oxygen that your body can take up and utilize for exercise. And hopefully that makes it a bit more clear where the V, the O2, and the max come from. Whenever we are performing aerobic exercise, the limiting factor is how much oxygen can be taken up and used by the working muscle. Similarly, if you are unaware, the definition of aerobic is oxygen demanding or requiring the presence of oxygen, and anaerobic, its counterpart, means it does a certain situation or process does not need oxygen. In regard to aerobic exercise, if your body can take up and use more oxygen, then it will be able to perform more work or sustain more work for longer periods of time. Your VO2 max is measured in milliliters of oxygen per kilogram body mass per minute of time. And that is just an easy way to kind of standardize the measurement of VO2 max from person to person, no matter what your height, your weight, or anything else is. In general, there are four primary physiological functions that are responsible for contributing to the volume of oxygen being used for exercise. And these include one, the cardiac output of your heart, two, the capillary density of your muscles, three, the mitochondrial density of your muscles, and four, your body's ability to use fat for fuel. And I know that a lot of the terms I just said there might sound really scientific or really advanced, but I promise you, if you bear with me, I'm going to make it all sound a lot easier and make it a bit easier to comprehend. So first off, let's talk about cardiac output. Now, this is the primary means in general in which your VO2 max is going to improve. In other words, the improvement in cardiac output of your heart is the primary means that's going to drive the improvements of your VO2 max. Cardiac output is a measure of how much blood your heart is able to pump with each contraction of itself. Mathematically, this is represented as your cardiac output equals the volume of blood ejected from your heart multiplied by the number of times it beats per minute, your heart rate, in other words. So in the very short term, when your body has a higher demand for blood, oxygen, and nutrients, the way that it increases cardiac output is simply by increasing your heart rate, by having more beats per minute. Over time, though, as you adapt to aerobic training, your heart becomes more able to pump more blood with every beat of itself, with every heartbeat. So, in other words, at any given heart rate, more blood is being pumped through the system as the amount of blood it pumps increases in response to aerobic training. Now, at the high end, when you are at your maximum heart rate, the amount of blood being pumped through the system will be higher if the volume of blood being injected with each heartbeat is higher after a period of training than it would have been before the period of training. It is also for this reason that there is a noticeable drop in your resting heart rate as you adapt to cardio. At rest, there is a certain given number of, or amount rather, of oxygen that your body needs to supply to the tissues in order to just keep the lights on. Through training, as the volume of blood being ejected from each heartbeat increases, it doesn't need as many beats per minute in order to supply that oxygen. So as a result, resting heart rate decreases. The second method through which your VO2 max may improve is through an increase in muscle capillary density. Now, capillaries are a blood vessel similar to your arteries and veins, but you can think of these as the exit ramps on the highway that bring the blood, oxygen, and nutrients from the main arterial supply from your arteries to the working muscle. So imagine two crowded highways. Each are equally crowded. One highway has one exit ramp. Another highway has 5 exit ramps. The one with 5 exit ramps is likely going to be able to dump the cars out more efficiently than the one with one exit ramp. And that's essentially what happens in this scenario. As the capillary density of your muscles improve, the ability of your blood to get from your arteries to the working muscle, and therefore oxygen from your arteries to the working muscle, becomes easier because there's more of those exit ramps. The third means through which your VO2 max may improve is through an increase in mitochondrial density. Now, everyone's probably heard of the mitochondria before, the powerhouse of the cell. And the reason it is called that it is because that the mitochondria are the main source of energy production within the cell. So as you aerobically train, your muscles will increase the number of mitochondria that they have within themselves. Because of this, there are more of the factories available that turn fats and carbohydrates into energy. And so that becomes an easier process, which is an aerobic oxygen demanding process. So, in other words, your body's ability to actually use the oxygen for energy creation becomes easier. The fourth and final main way through which your VO2 max may improve is through an increase in utilization of fats as opposed to carbohydrates for fuel. Now, if you were to compare two individuals, one was highly trained and one was untrained or sedentary, and you had them go for a 20-minute run, for example, the individual who was untrained, the sedentary individual, would be likely to use somewhere close to 100% of carbohydrates for fuel, whereas the person who is trained would use somewhere more to 50-70% of carbohydrates for fuel, and the rest would be fats as utilization for fuel. Those numbers are also made up, the 50-70%. My point in saying that is just that a trained person will use more fats for fuel at the onset of exercise, whereas a untrained person will use almost exclusively carbohydrate. The reason this is beneficial is because one of the primary drivers of true physical fatigue is when your carbohydrate stores deplete. Now, carbohydrates are primarily stored within your muscle because that's where they are often used. If those stores deplete, then you will feel a real feeling of physical fatigue. If you are able to use fats earlier on for fuel in the workout, then those carbohydrate stores will last longer, and the sensation of fatigue will be pushed off until farther along in the workout. Similarly, because you will have access to a greater number of substrates to use for fuel, your ability to, again, use oxygen for the purpose of creating energy will be increased and your VO2 max will be better. So that covers all the nuts and bolts of what your VO2 max is and how your body actually uses oxygen for creating energy. Now let's talk about why any of this matters and why you should care. First off, starting with just health in general, your VO2 max is largely considered one of the best predictors of how long you'll live, or at least it is commonly accepted that your cardiovascular fitness is one of the strongest, if not the strongest, predictors of lifespan. Papers vary in the numbers that they actually produce, but common figures you might see are that for every 1 milliliter per kilogram per minute increase in VO2 max translates to a decrease in relative risk of 9% of all-cause mortality, which is just your chance of dying of any sort of disease except age. It should be noted that improving your VO2 max will not necessarily increase your genetic potential for lifespan or your genetic potential for how long you'll live. Rather, having a high VO2 max will give you a better chance of actually reaching that genetic potential. In regard to fitness and athletic performance, VO2 max is one of the primary indicators of how good someone's endurance is. At a point, VO2 maxes may kind of plateau and other factors will be indicators of an individual's capacity for endurance performance. But nonetheless, it is generally accepted that VO2 max is the first indicator people look at if they want to see how good someone's endurance is. Even if all you care about is muscle building, strength, things like that, things that are commonly seen as opposite to endurance performance, if your VO2 max is higher, it is reasonable to infer that your recovery in between sets of strength training and in between sessions of strength training will be better because the process of recovery is an aerobic oxygen demanding process, and if your body's ability to deliver oxygen to those muscles that worked, you can infer that your recovery will be better. So now let's talk about how to test your VO2 max, and I want to preface this by saying you may not necessarily need to test your VO2 max. Many people are good enough just doing the activities that improve VO2 max and never actually knowing what their actual VO2 max is. But if you're a data-oriented person, or perhaps you are training for some competitive race, then it might be a worthwhile thing to look at. Now, to really get a true estimate of what your VO2 max is, you need some pretty extensive laboratory equipment. But there are two methods you can use that anyone can use that will give you a good enough ballpark estimate. The first method is to run as far as you can in 12 minutes, and then, of course, record the distance you complete within those 12 minutes. The second method is to run 1.5 miles as fast as you can, and then record the time it takes you to run those 1.5 miles. If you have access to a track, then I would generally recommend the 1.5 mile run, as it is going to be easier to standardize in test-retest situations. If you do not have access to a 1.5 mile, if you do not have access to a track, then I would recommend the 12-minute run. That, of course, requires that you have some means of measuring the distance you complete within those 12 miles, though. If you go out and try to do these or attempt these, then I will cite a table in the show notes or the comment box below, whatever you call it, that you can compare your time to and use to see what your estimated VO2 max is and how you rank up to other people of your similar sex and age. Now, it should be noted that a VO2 max, if it's done right, should suck. After all, it is a maximal aerobic test. So for your scores to be accurate, you need to push yourself pretty hard. Similarly, given how stressful reaching your VO2 max can be, this sort of testing should not necessarily be done very often. So finally, let's talk about how to improve your VO2 max. Now, to really cover this in its full depth would require multiple videos, and doing so is something that I often work with clients in my one-on-one coaching, largely because the best path to do so varies greatly person to person, depending on fitness level, depending on goals, etc. However, what I'd like to do with this video is give you a quick framework that will be pretty much more than good enough for the vast majority of people who are watching this video. Now, starting off, there are two main variables to consider when you are looking to design any sort of cardiovascular or aerobic training program. Those are one, intensity of exercise, and two, duration of exercise. A framework that you will see recommended in multiple sources that manipulates these variables, duration and intensity, is the following. So one, that 75% of your work should be done around 60 to 80% of your maximum heart rate. Two, around 20% of your work should be done somewhere between 80 to 90% of your maximum heart rate. And three, finally, that 5% of your work should be done between 90 to 100% of your maximum heart rate. And it's worth noting that those percentages do not need to be perfect by any means. Just the overall idea that most of your work is done easy, some of your work is done at a moderate intensity, and a small minority of your work is done at your maximal capacity. Now, if you have a heart rate monitor, these percentages all, of course, require that you know what your maximum heart rate is. To figure that out would require a true max heart rate test, which is beyond the scope of this particular video. But to estimate it in a way that's going to be good enough for most people, you can use the simple equation 220 minus your age equals your maximum heart rate. Now, this equation tends to vary 10 to 15 beats per minute, person to person. But, for most people, that's going to be good enough. Even if your particular situation ends up being actually off by 15 beats per minute, you only really need to be perfect with these heart rate percentages if you are doing super high volumes of training and training for something like the Tour de France. But odds are, I'm assuming that is not you. Now, if you do not have a heart rate monitor and you don't want to buy one, that's totally fine. There's another way, rather, that you can gauge these intensities. And that is just by subjectively ascribing, a subjective intensity to each heart rate percentage. So as I alluded to before, you can consider 60 to 80% of your maximum heart rate an easy intensity, or, rather one that you feel that you can sustain for quote unquote forever. 80 to 90% of your maximum heart rate, you can consider a medium effort. And then 90 to 100% of your maximum heart rate, of course, is going to be a hard, and specifically a very hard, maximal effort bout. It's also worth noting that it does not necessarily matter what sort of cardiovascular modality you choose, whether it's running, cycling, rowing, some combination, or really anything else. The only point of note is that lifting weights or weight circuits or body weight circuits are generally not going to be appropriate choices here, because your ability to use oxygen for fuel is not going to be the limiting factor in such activities. An example schedule of putting this all together could be that on Monday, you do two sets of 2 minutes of maximal effort running. Tuesday and Thursday, you do 30 to 45 minutes of an incline walk. And in this example, an incline walk would be attributed to the easy subjective intensity. And then on a Saturday, you could do a 30-minute moderate effort run. And this particular schedule that I just laid out, you can do it on its own, or you can combine with some sort of strength program. Either way, I hope that sort of illustrates, what I mean by using those three different buckets of cardiovascular intensities and durations. So that's it for this video. I really hope that was helpful or enjoyable, and I will see you next time. Have a good rest of it.